So tonight, really the topic, the real topic is happiness in daily living. But I will talk about beliefs and thinking and how we can need to step out of our thinking. But the reason that I'll talk about that is because it's very relative to happiness in daily living. I'd also like to talk about this question that we often have, or an approach to seeking, which is asking, what can I do? What should I do? And that question comes after hours of me explaining that the realization that sets in, that needs to set in, is a realization that we're not the doers. Now that's not just some throwaway line, we're not the doers. It's pointing to something that's here. It's pointing to what we can call actuality or real dynamics that we don't see, dynamics that we overlook. And the overlooking of these dynamics is deeply, deeply ingrained. It's something that has been put in place as part of our growing process, which includes a feedback loop of the world around us from a very young age. So from the baby is aware of the world around them, the world they are in. And as that feedback goes into their system and they start getting feedback of touch and sound, they start to form experience of life that's different to the experience they have when they first pop out. So they hear a certain sound of a person's voice and they see it in conjunction with that person, and so they start to form an association. Whereas before that association is received in the form of experience, the association just isn't there. So we might wonder, or often we don't wonder, why a baby understands life the way they understand it, and not only a baby but an adult too. And the reason is that life has ingrained, has put in place that way of understanding life. So at first a baby isn't familiar with the fact that the sensation of them touching their other finger, grabbing their other finger, they haven't set in place the association that is my finger. And as the other hand grabs the finger often enough, the feedback loop of sensation plus the understanding that, I am in control of this hand, creates a sense, that's got something to do with me, as opposed to when I grab the bedpost, it's an object that I am not. And so the baby starts off not knowing that, doesn't have the feedback, doesn't have the intellect at that stage to think about these things. And so even as a baby, a young baby, it doesn't have the intellect and the vocabulary. And yet it will start to realize that this is me. Or it starts off, if you look at a baby in the very early weeks and months, they are aware, but it becomes very clear that they don't have any sense of being located anywhere. So you see them on their back with their legs and arms moving, and it seems quite clear that they haven't quite figured out that those legs have anything to do with the awareness, the consciousness that is aware of life. And so that's why when you go and dangle, a rattle in front of the baby, they're interested in it because it's experience They're not necessarily interested in the rattle from the perspective of the body. They may not have even grounded in to the sense that, oh, this is my body. So they are aware of the rattle as an object in awareness. And for a while, the body too is just an object in awareness that they have the experience of, but the correlation that gets put in place down the track isn't quite there yet. So this sense of me as a doer is part of the experiential feedback that the baby and then the young child receives. And it's the way the thinking works, and the way the thinking is experienced, as in, well, I moved my hands after I saw the cookie and had a thought that says, oh, I want that, and I need to get it before my brother or sister gets it. And so the way the whole thing comes together, the seeing of the cookie, the thought, oh, I want it and I'm going to get it before they do, the moving of the hand, it all creates the impression of being a separate autonomous entity that is in control of what they do. And some of the finer details of how this all comes about are not registered. So the picture that is formed is a picture based on what is registered, and what's registered is the more gross sensations and aspects of the experience, and some of the subtle links are missed, and so the conclusions that get formed are wrong. So really, we have a deeply, deeply ingrained, when I say deeply, deeply ingrained, it's because if you're 30 years old, if you're 50 years old, it's been reinforced, the experience is reinforcing that sense over and over again. So for your whole life, moment after moment, you have been receiving a sense that you are the doer. You are a separate, independent entity in complete control of everything you think, that you, as some me entity, so this me is the imagination of an entity that is there, that is the controller. And so that sense gets put in place. It's a belief. It's psychological. So psychological means it doesn't actually exist, except it comes into existence because the psychological belief says it's there. So the belief itself creates the impression of a me, of a doer. And so the teaching is saying there is no doer. You are not the doer. There is no doer. Life is a happening. It's not kidding. Ramesh used to say you need to go to 3 satsangs. The first one, where you listen to the concept, and incidentally, he used to say it to make a point. In reality, this never seems to be how it works, probably because of the fact that it's so deeply, deeply ingrained. We hear it and it just doesn't penetrate. It's like water off a duck's back. And if it penetrates, it might penetrate in a moment and we like, oh wow, but then there's a reverting back. So anyway, he'd say, go to 3 satsangs. The first one is to listen to the concepts. And he said they're all intellectual concepts, or concepts put forward in very plain, simple English language. So most people can listen to the concept and go, oh, I understand what you're saying. It's not my experience maybe, but I understand what you're saying. So then he said, great, you understand the concepts intellectually. So then you go away and you think about what has been said in satsang, and you're bound to have some questions and needing some clarity on some of the points as to how they link in together, what they really mean. So he said, you need to come back for a second satsang. And in the second satsang, we'll go through the questions you have. once those questions have been asked and an answer given, your intellectual understanding, following on from the first explanation, will be more complete. You'll understand the conceptual framework and what's being said more completely. So then you can go away again. If any other questions come up, come back for the third satsang and we'll deal with them. So what he's saying is, it's not something that needs to take a lifetime. The message is very simple. You're not the doer. You never have been the doer. The doer is an interpretation of life, an interpretation of how you and the other function that is wrong. And it's that interpretation of life which creates the psychological identity, which is the identity we come to know ourselves as, the identity that is essentially the filter through which life is experienced and processed, and that belief in personal doership is the ground from which all human suffering arises. And human suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself, because when we think we're the doer, we generally don't feel good enough, or we feel like we need to make life happen. So we're looking back in the past, regretting the things that didn't turn out well, not feeling good enough because I didn't do them well enough. And we're looking into the future, worried and with expectations of what our happiness is, and therefore saying, well, I need to work very hard as the doer to make it happen in the future. And in the mix, there's also this sense of pride, which is the same attitude of doership. And when things turn out well, we go, look what I have done. Look what I've achieved. So it's the opposite of shame, which is, oh, that wasn't so good. I'm not good enough. And then the attitude of personal doership towards the others in life. You shouldn't be doing this. You should be doing that. You should be delivering pleasure, pleasure, pleasure to me. You should be doing that means, and I should be doing this, and I need to do that, means that we have a commentary about everything that's happening in life. And that is the basis on which the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry, and the expectation and attachment to outcomes is there. The attachment to outcomes is linked to this doership, where we say, what I need in the future in order to feel different to how I feel now, because I don't feel good now, don't feel complete, don't know what my purpose is. I've got this bitterness towards myself, my bitterness to the other, and maybe all that will go away when I can finally get life to look a certain way. So that's the attachment to outcome part, which is also an error. Because when the doership belief falls away, which is this psychological identity that believes it is something that doesn't even exist, it's a belief. When that falls away, there's a resting in the core of the human being, what we've always been at our core, in our essence. And that essence feels comfortable. So it doesn't make the mistake of saying, oh, I feel not complete yet because I don't have life looking a certain way. And when it does feel incomplete, it makes that mistake. So attachment to outcome is the error. So those two ideas, the psychological identity that says this is what I am, which is an interpretation of the human being and of life that is wrong. An interpretation that got put in place based on how life presented and what we locked in about life, which is a fairly standard conclusion that it seems humanity makes. this basic conclusion about what life is and who we are, probably because of the way the brain forms, how the experience of life is received, and that very specific feedback loop creates a very common mistake. So the teaching says you're not the doer. And we listen to all of this, and then the first question is, okay, so, but I don't feel peace of mind. So the teaching also says, if the belief in personal doership collapses, then there is a connecting to the core of who we are, which we could even say is a connection to Source, where we feel that we are being lived by Source. So the psychological identity that interprets how we move and how we function a particular way is fallen away, and a more authentic interpretation of life happens. And so there is a connection where we realize that what we are is impersonal consciousness of Source linked to a particular body-mind, functioning through the body-mind. So the impersonal consciousness of Source linked to the body-mind, functioning through it as personal consciousness, the experience of life we have. And we realize, yes, it's an experience of living, but I am being lived. The speaking is happening, the comprehending of what the other person says, the listening is happening. And so we then appreciate the experience for it being an experience of life, understanding that what comes next is heavily dependent on what we could call destiny, or we can look at it, what comes next is based on the circumstance, which is not in my control, and the way the body functions. And that's the experience, and I get to watch it as an unfolding of life, which is a very different experience of life, as opposed to feeling like I need to make life happen and I'm not good enough. The other should be like this. Whenever the other delivers pain to me, it's seen as an attack on who I am by another, so therefore I have to hate them. So there's this whole narrative, this whole interpretation of life that falls away. There's nothing to think about. Someone did this to me. It was destiny. It was in the can. It was the story for it to turn out like that. What am I supposed to think about? If I say they shouldn't have done that, that's me not realizing that no one's the doer. So when the realization that no one is the doer sets in, these stories, these these interpretations of life and the feelings that come with them, because the feeling of uncomfortableness is because we know ourselves as a belief identity that is always going to be challenged by life. And in and of itself, there is no capacity for the belief identity to feel fulfilled or satisfied. That particular psychological identity has no capacity to feel fulfillment. What it has is the capacity to feel better than someone else by comparing to someone else and seeing that and creating an image of them as less. And that image is essentially a judgment of the other relative to some benchmark, a belief of how life should be, what is important in life, a benchmark, and then we make them less. And that making the other less makes me feel more. So it's a psychological boost. So the psychological identity has the capacity to feel better relative to something else. The human being gets glimpses of contentment sometimes when life delivers outcomes that we're looking for, not actually because of the outcome, but because in that moment, the seeking for more in the future stops because of the temporary satisfaction. And because the temporary satisfaction is there, the seeking actually believes that it has got what it needs. And it takes some time for the experience to be, oh, this wasn't what I needed. It takes some time for the psychological identity to kick back in again, to start blaming other people, and for the uncomfortableness of the psychological entity to set in, and we feel it and we go, oh, that wasn't the answer that I thought it was. So we do get some glimpses of contentment and peace in life, even when the psychological identity is there, running the show, because the psychological identity gets temporarily, and very definitely temporarily, because the deep ingrained sense of who we are hasn't gone anywhere, is temporarily disarmed. It's like, oh, it has nothing to do in this moment because it has, found the soulmate. And so it engages in the activity of being with the soulmate, and it engages fully, which disarms the doer. And there can be a sense of peace, very short-lived, sense of fulfillment. It's like, this is what I always knew I needed. And it's just the satisfaction of our attachment to something, temporary satisfaction. See, I almost feel like just stopping here. I could have stopped 10 minutes ago. Said, there you go, that's it. Because it is it. I mean, I keep talking and I then start possibly confusing the point. Like trying to give more information for us to understand my point. Whereas all of the extra information might be confusing the point that the teaching is saying we are not the doer. We have never been the doer. No one has ever been a doer. It doesn't say stop doing things because you're not the doer. It's talking about an attitude of doership. So you believe yourself to be the doer. It's saying you're not the doer. Life is a happening, and the mechanism by which life happens, the mechanism by which the predetermined story of life unfolds, is the mechanism of an individual making choices in each moment. That's the mechanism. The human being finds themselves at a crossroad. They have to turn left or right. That's a decision that needs to be made. Now, I'm not saying, when I use the word choice or decision, I don't mean it's your choice as a separate independent entity, but it does require a decision to get made in order for the story to carry on. Otherwise, the story would be a story of standing at the crossroad. Now, because the individual has to make a decision to go left or right, doesn't suddenly mean, oh, now they are the doer. It just means that the mechanism by which the story will unfold is decision making. The decision making is not the individual's doing, it's part of the functioning of the individual. They see themselves or they find themselves in a circumstance. They are able to be aware of the circumstance through the senses. The brain processes the circumstance. So you're walking in the forest, you come to a crossroad and you look left and you look right. You look left and you see some houses and what looks like an industrial estate a few hundred meters outside the forest there. And you look that way and you see a big lake. And you have a decision to make. And the decision gets made based on the circumstance you're in and the way that the intellect processes the situation. And if it realizes it only has, 5 minutes, it might say, I need to go left because I needed to find a way to go back towards the car park or whatever. And on the other hand, if you've got lots of time and you want to enjoy nature, it looks left, sees buildings, looks right and sees a big lake, and it turns right. Now it feels like that's my decision. Now, it is a decision made through the body-mind organism as part of the unfolding of life, as part of the story of life. But it was made, when we look at it, as a result of the circumstance we found ourselves in. Now, if you'd looked right and there was a bunch of hooligans down there, you wouldn't have gone right. You would have gone forward, let's say, or returned back from where you came. And that would have been a different decision because the circumstance is different. And it would seem like, oh, I chose to go forward. And we can say, I chose, you did. The process is choice. But choice doesn't mean choice in the definition that we normally have when we believe we're the doer. So the English language presupposes doership, because that's the standard human perspective of themselves. So when we write in language and there are verbs, the assumption is I did. I as the doer, me as the doer did that. So choice, ordinarily, if we come to see life as a predetermined story, we go, there is no such thing as choice. You know, choice means it's not predetermined story. I'm saying, it's very carefully worded, the mechanism by which the predetermined story of life unfolds is decision-making or choice-making. I don't mean, when I say choice, the doer. There is no doer. There never has been a doer, but we're always making choices. That's life. Interhuman relationships and decision-making. So the teaching says, what are we really looking for in life? And the thinking mind, the psychological identity, which we can call the thinking mind, has all of its ideas about what we're looking for in life. A perfect life. A life that follows certain morals and codes of ethics and codes of standards, maybe. A life that delivers pleasure, pleasure, pleasure to me. That's the idea that the person with the deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment to outcome might say, that's what I'm looking for in life. And after we've spent a lifetime looking for that, we may have the realization, I've lived my life like that, and it hasn't delivered contentment and satisfaction. So the teachings, once again, the teachings are just guides, pointers, things to think about, things to look at. And you have to look at it based on your own experience, which means you really need to process what's being said. That's where I started at the beginning of the talk, is that it's not complicated, but it doesn't sink in. Because what has already sunk in is the complete opposite identity. So I'm saying this because it helps us to see, yes, I hear it. I even get it. And yet I find myself then functioning in life where I'm blaming the other for doing such and such, and have a story that extends in time for days about why the other shouldn't have done that, how it was an attack on who I am. And I feel that that was absolutely unacceptable. There's no part of me that accepts it. And the falling away of the psychological identity, in effect, is the birthing of ongoing acceptance of life. Acceptance because the identity that says I need life to be a certain way has fallen away, and instead there is a witnessing of life as a happening. Understanding, it's like watching a movie unfold. We don't say, oh, it shouldn't have turned out like that. Well, we do. The doership in us can say that about the movie, but halfway through, when we're still watching it, we don't say, shouldn't be like that. Why did he say that? Because we understand what it is. We understand it's a creation unfolding. Ramesh would put it very succinctly. The movie has been written, directed, produced, acted, and it's in the can. from beginning to end. Now, that's, I'm one for not believing things. That's what this talk was going to be after this first section. Don't just believe something, but why are these concepts introduced? They exist in life in other places. So this block theory of all of life existing in a block is a theory that is now starting or has been in quantum physics. It's very different to how we experience life. And yet, because we're told life is not as it seems, science starts to show us, is starting to realize that time is not linear, that there are connections across time between things that seem unconnected. And so as we go deeper into understanding the makeup of the universe, we start to see that actually from certain perspectives, everything has happened at once. And that it gets experienced as chronological, as part of the witnessing, the observation of life. So we have this theory in physics that until life is observed, there is infinite potentiality. And it's only at the point of observation of something that the actuality of it collapses into existence. Until it's observed, it remains in its infinite potentiality. Now, this is very hard for our intellect to comprehend. It just seems completely theoretical. And to some extent, that particular theory is theoretical relative to the experience of life. So, as well as putting forward some explanations that require a certain type of thinking, we can also put forward explanations that show us based on causality, which is an observation of life that we can have that doesn't require us to see life from many different perspectives. And if we observe on a causal basis, we can just observe the very fact that the human body is very, very intricate and complex. We are an amazingly intricate biological instrument. And instruments function according to their design, according to their structure. That's what we are, a biologically functioning instrument through which consciousness functions. So consciousness is then aware of the functioning of this biological instrument, aware of the experience that is created as a result of the functioning. So it's not necessarily aware of the synapses and the electromagnetic pulses in the brain. It's aware of the outputs, let's say, of those electromagnetic pulses in the brain. So it becomes aware of a thought. So as a result of our very complex, if we have heartburn, so I've jumped back to, if we have heartburn, awareness is aware of the heartburn, which is a result of the biological instrument functioning a certain way. So that explanation is showing we're not the doers. I mentioned it before, we would turn right in the forest if we look to the right and there's a nice river or lake, or we see an interesting bird. But if we turn right and there's the hooligans, we may choose to go in a different direction, which is really a happening as a result of factors we're not in control of. The circumstance, we weren't in control of what was going to be down there on the right, and we're not in control of our preferences, which makes us move away from things that we would prefer not to be exposed to. So anyway, what was my point? The point is, we're not the doers. And our thinking keeps telling us we need to live life as if we're the doer. We need to process life as if it doesn't actually tell us that, it just does it. It processes life as if we are the doer. It blames the other, it blames oneself. It has pride. It has expectations, it worries about something that's going to happen. So watch that process based on doership. See, yes, put a tick next to it. When you see it, say, yes, that is what is ingrained. Yes, that makes me feel uncomfortable. Yes, that means I spend a whole lot of time thinking uncomfortable thoughts and feeling like that was a terrible day. Understand that we exist on a dimension that is outside of the flow of life, as well as on a dimension that is part of the flow of life. The human being is complex and magnificent. And we completely overlook our magnificence because of this idea of who we are that keeps us limited to seeing life on the material plane. What it does is it keeps us believing our thinking, because the psychological identity is essentially a thought identity, a belief identity. And it thinks. The belief identity creates thoughts, and it believes those thoughts to be true. This is the rub here, is that the psychological identity exists because our system has formed it based on believing that's the truth, interpreting life, and then this identity, this doer, this controller, which is just a false interpretation of how life happens, comes into existence as a belief structure. A belief structure that, if we were to look at the structure of the brain, beliefs are they're not just bits of information in filing cabinets. They are the way the brain is physically structured. The way the connections are made create our beliefs and our sense of self. So that structure is in place. And for as long as that structure remains in place, it creates thoughts believing the thoughts are true because the structure itself is in place, because the system has said this is how things are. This is true. So then that structure says life needs to be this way, X, Y, Z. You need to function a certain way. You need to be honest. And when the identity says you need to be honest, it then says honesty is true. If anyone has a different view, it's an attack on the identity. A different belief, a different opinion is an attack on the identity. So we have no flexibility to say, you're right. You're right, honesty is not the best policy. You're right. When the psychological identity is there, we're only able to say you're right if there's an agreement with that psychological identity, with the ideas, the beliefs of that psychological identity. So we only say you're right if you agree with me, or if you manage to put forward an argument that actually changes what the psychological identity values in that moment. And we've all seen that. It's like, oh, that's a great point. You're right. I didn't see it that way. That's because we agree with them, because the psychological identity is now saying, oh, that's what I hold as true. When the psychological identity falls away, not only are we connected into our core, which is much more quantum than material, we also understand that thoughts serve a purpose on the material level. They serve a purpose in practical daily living. However, when it comes to interhuman relationship, the thoughts tend to create conflict. And so being outside of the psychological identity, or having that dissolved, as soon as a discussion happens where there is conflict, it's like, you're right. You're right, because it's seen that from their perspective, they're right. From their perspective, with their structure being a certain way, that's the right way of seeing life. And our structure is a particular way, so we will see life a certain way. So it's not saying you're wrong. You're wrong would mean you should be different. And it's not realizing that the structure is what's creating the output. So you're right. Ramesh would tell a story which highlights this point. And it's a funny story. But it might not be appreciated when we're still believing that our assessment of life is correct, is true. And so if we feel that animal cruelty is, the worst that can happen in life, that's our assessment. If our thought hasn't seen that it's very relative, which is part of the collapse of the psychological identity, it's needed, it's an important part for us to see the relativity, then accepting someone else's view on that topic is impossible. So if we're still heavily identified with our thinking, then the story might seem silly. There's the point to it, the theme of it is very profound as far as happiness for the human being goes. So Ramesh used to be a manager at the Bank of India. At the end of his career, he was the managing director. So he, at various points in his career, would deal with high net worth clients. And he had one particular client that was a very good client, a very big client. And he called up Ramesh one day and said, look, I value your opinion. It's not really a work issue, or it's not within the scope of our normal relationship. I'd like to come and have a chat with you. So Ramesh said, yes, sure, come in. Gave a time. When the time came, the secretary said, so-and-so's here. He called him in. They sat down. And this client started, before he had any time to do it, started unloading his interpretation of his relationship with his wife. She keeps trying to tell me that this is how we should do things. She's always nagging. She doesn't appreciate that I have to go to work and that I'm running a big organization. And Ramesh was listening and saying, yes, you're right. Yes, you're right. And at the end of the conversation, the client said, it was a great thing you offered to me, to be able to come here and just for you to hear my story and see my point of view, and see that my wife is being unreasonable. Ramesh says, yes, it's I can see. So anytime. And the man left very contently. And the next day, the wife was on the phone. And so Ramesh thought, oh, this is unusual. So he asked, how can I help you? And she said, look, I'd like to come in and have a chat with you. So Ramesh said, yes, sure, you come in. And she came in and started explaining how her husband was unreasonable and he wasn't giving enough time to the family and this and that. And Ramesh was saying, yes, you're right. You're right. I completely agree. You're right. And she said, at the end of it, she says, this is fantastic. Thank you. I needed to come in and talk to you. My husband said it would be a good idea. And so I feel very satisfied. Thank you. So she left. And that afternoon, he went home and he was talking to his wife and he said, yesterday, one of my big clients wanted to see me. He came in and I was so surprised. He came in and started telling me about his relationship with his wife. And I said to him, yes, you're right. Yes, you're right. I completely agree. You're right. And he left very content and happy. And then, would you believe it? In the morning, the wife rings up and asked to come and see me. And so she came in and she did the same thing, but in reverse. And I agreed with her. I said, yes, you're right. You're right. I completely agree. And she left very happy and satisfied. And then his wife looked at him and said, Ramesh, how could you possibly tell the husband that he's right and the wife that she's right? It makes no sense. And Ramesh said, you're absolutely right. And the point being that when we are aware that it's our happiness that we're looking for, the end of suffering, and we start to realize how our view is of how life should be, and we can't accept, we can't understand that the other is different, that the other will see things differently, they're forced to see things differently. And so if we get into an argument about who's right and who's wrong, trying to win the argument, then what we end up with is conflict. Now, I'm not suggesting that we always agree with the other, but if we find ourselves in a situation where it's clear we don't agree, the point is to not turn it into a conflict, an attitudinal conflict, which will make us feel attacked. So to be able to find a part of yourself that really sees that's irrelevant, that talking about politics beyond a point where it's entertaining is irrelevant. So yes, actually, you're right. And if there isn't an attachment to outcomes, which really means a connecting to yourself, then we don't need to be right. The psychological identity is essentially a belief about who we are, a belief about what we need. And it's so deeply ingrained that it keeps us living within the realm of thinking. And what I've just mentioned, the dropping it and saying, you're right, just can't happen. We will have ingrained conditioning from childhood that we don't see as being there from childhood. And so if anyone is different to the way we are, we'll think they're wrong. We can't do otherwise if this set of beliefs, which is a certain way of relating to all of the relative functions of the human being, especially thinking. If we haven't seen the relativity of thought, the relativity of our interpretation of life, including in the end, the relativity of what we are, or at least the relativeness of our interpretation of what we are, then that identity doesn't fall away, because we don't see the error of the principle of taking an interpretation as truth. It happens. That's what is happening, is beliefs are taken to be true. What we agree with is taken to be true, and we don't realize that that is a thinking error, or that is something that's in place because of a certain functioning of the human cognition. And the only way is for us to start seeing our beliefs, and hopefully having them exposed to us as being stupid thinking, which really means usually we need to be given alternative explanations to the explanations that we have about a certain belief. If someone can create a juxtaposition, if someone can create a explanation for a phenomena that we haven't considered, so we see the phenomena, but we haven't considered an alternative explanation for it, and we're sure it's because of our belief, what we're sure that action or that thing is there because of what we believe put it there, or our explanation for it. And if someone explains, actually it's there because of something we didn't consider, especially if we have argued it. So this humility that comes in when we are humiliated, actually, can be extremely valuable. If we argue a point, this is how it is. Which is what belief and attachment or being lost in belief does. It doesn't see the relativity of it, so it argues something. And hopefully you get embarrassed many times when you get proved wrong. You realize that you were making a thinking error, and someone shows you another way. And as that happens, we become more and more familiar with being wrong because we hold a strong idea about something. So critical thinking and explanations of thinking biases, which explain why we favor certain things and why we will run with certain ideas and certain explanations. When we start to understand these critical thinking biases, and someone says, hey, have you ever considered that there is a conformity bias, for example, which means you will want to see and you will want to believe and you will favor an explanation that conforms or that confirms what you already believe. And when this gets explained, a functioning of our thinking that we didn't see might get seen. And so we're then understanding how our thinking is so prone to bias, certain different types of bias. And bias basically means it isn't seeing the full picture very well. Now, why is this important? This is important because the deeply ingrained sense of me, the psychological doer, includes attachment. And attachment is all based on belief. And so this structure needs to be seen. It's like, why do I believe this? Why do I believe that? Especially, why do I believe my happiness is to be found in outcomes? Why do I believe the other is the doer and I'm the doer? And as we start seeing the the tendency for us to believe things, we might start realizing that what the teachings are saying is true. Life is not as it seems. You just believe it to be a certain way, and therefore it gets experienced that way. So that's why teachings often will describe life in really extreme ways. They are ways in which we can experience life. And so by describing life as we know it as completely wrong, describing life as unreal, forces us to question, is the bookcase real? Is time real? Is space real? So if this is one way that teachings break our ingrained belief that keeps life looking a certain way, by telling us that life is not that way, and helping us to see it from a perspective where suddenly the illusion is different. And then the whole thing collapses. Our sense of self collapses. And we realize, I just believed, not a sort of conscious belief, but on a deep, deep level. I believed so many things and I didn't realize I believed them. So that's why it might be oversimplistic to think that someone can listen to 3 satsangs and that's the end of suffering. But at a certain point, when the point is made, that really hear that what the teaching is saying is that the problem is the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership, seeing yourself as the doer and the other as the doer. And all of the suffering, all of the fighting, psychological resistance to life is all based on thinking life could be different, thinking you could be different. And as we find that thinking gets interfered with because there's a remembering that's not true, and we might find ourselves dropping into a quiet place more and more regularly because we stop buying into that story of life, that story of life should be different. So I'll just finish off explaining a thinking process that's happening at the moment. That when I explain it, you might see it and understand what I'm saying. There's all sorts of theories out there about why we are going through this period of time with these lockdowns and the virus and what have you. There's people saying it's a hoax. There's people saying it's all about 5G. There's people saying it's about reptilian overlords. There's people saying it's about sex trafficking. There's people talking about vaccines and microchips and governments controlling the population. It might just be because there's a virus. And so there are all of these different ideas. Now, let's take 5G and look at that group that say 5G is an attempt to, or part of the scheme to control us by having a technology capacity that doesn't exist yet. And once that technology capacity is in terms of a grid is set in place, then slowly we will be forced to become essentially electronic instruments through the use of bracelets or through the use of chips or through the use of our phones or nanotechnology or whatever. Now, let's say that in the future that's proved to be correct. The fact is that anyone that is saying this is the way it is engaging in very poor quality thinking. So even if they turn out to be correct, they're still being stupid. What I mean by stupid means that very poor quality thinking is taking place in their body-mind organism. The instrument is saying this is the truth, when the information just isn't there. Now, there might be information from certain people that say this is dangerous and whatever. And when we look at it, we just see that the technology hasn't been tested sufficiently, which you could argue should be the case before it's rolled out. It should be, because once it's rolled out, it will be harder to test it in absence of certain other interrelated qualities. So there could be all sorts of other variables that we're then testing it with, and we won't know what the real effect is. So we could argue it needs to be properly tested before it's rolled out. And that information, that those outcomes, that data isn't there. There is a lot of ways of packaging the data so that one argument is made or the other argument is made, and one of them or the other is going to be correct. So there's information out there that says, it's not radiation that can cook and kill you because of the frequency. And so even if it's 15 times or 100 times more intense than previous radiation, it's 100 times of a radiation that is at the same level. So you don't add them all on top of each other this way. So the example is, if you've got a 10-meter well and someone throws a ball up 1 meter, but then throws the ball up 10 times, it doesn't mean that the ball has reached the top of the well. It's only gone a meter each time. So this isn't about talking about conspiracy theories, really. What it's trying to point out is that we can have poor quality thinking, where we think we know something, which is really just us following something that our brain prefers, without realizing that the information isn't there. And so even if you picked the right side and you ended up being right in the future, you're still being stupid. So stop it. Realize we don't know. We're not in control. We want to conjure up ways of being in control. So we say, I know. That doesn't make you in control. It makes you stupid. Stop it. It'll make you quiet. So I think we can take some questions. Hello, Olga.
Yes. Roger, I love your humor. And
Thank you.
I really appreciate the time you spent there, because you create an atmosphere in which I can deeply relax, and it's just amazing. I mean, it's beautiful and profound, and it's very precious to me. It's like, whatever. And it's just so interesting to see this movement, how then afterwards, I mean, you spent an hour, 90 minutes talking and put all your care into it, your intelligence, and try to leave out your own poor thinking. And then come the questions, and then starts all this mental confetti again, and seems to destroy all this beautiful atmosphere you created. I mean, it's so weird to see this. It's so precious what you do. And then everything gets trampled over by poor quality thinking again. And it's just, I need to understand this mechanism. Is this just part of this interrelated opposites?
Mm-hmm.
Or isn't the idea of a satsang that we create an atmosphere in which we then can incubate and carry it into life and rest in it? And yeah, I don't really know what I want to say right now. I had another interesting thing. Some days ago, I walked with my dog, and I had this feeling the dog is walking me.
Mm-hmm.
It was so beautiful. I mean, my sense of me directing and being the doer was just gone, and there was just this dance of life, just taking me by the hand
Mm-hmm.
and showing me around. And this was so indescribably beautiful. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Anyway, just super thank you for everything, and wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you, Olga. It's always nice to have you start off because you always say such nice things, which is pleasure.
No, but I cannot help it because it's wonderful. Maybe it's just the opposite of my self-inflicted suffering that I entertained for the last 50 years. It just bubbles up now and gets released. And yeah, but this is just how I feel. I mean, I have no expectation or attachment to outcome. And I wanted to apologize. The other day I said, oh, you pushed my buttons in the beginning. And I can see how this is a subtle form of blame.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
And
I don't
it's
remember,
very
but
subtle.
okay.
Yeah, I said, oh, in the beginning, you pushed my buttons when I started watching your videos.
Ah, right. Okay. Yes, I do remember. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just the whole mechanism is so subtle. I mean, with all the how we create really our own suffering. I can attest. I mean, it makes total sense what you describe, and it's so precious to have those tools available
Mm-hmm.
to recalibrate again my identity, my attitude to this here and now, this unnameable
Mm-hmm.
presence.
That's beautiful. That's the key, to be able to find that our thinking stops taking us out of here, which is where we know that aspect of ourself that really doesn't need things to be different. I know that if someone is feeling, very disconnected and therefore thinks that there are a lot of problems in their life that need to be fixed, which is part of the seeking feeling sometimes, is we feel disconnected and there just isn't any sense of okayness, and that's, to me, that's completely understood, but it's just about it gets fixed in an instant, and this is the gift if someone realizes that the attitude can be seen, and if we start finding that the blame, for example, and the thinking of doership starts falling away, the whole sense of self changes radically. And the person can be so amazed that something that they were so passionate about, feeling like that absolutely is what needs to happen in life. It's the only solution. It's the only, I will never stop fighting for that. And if the attitude changes and they suddenly drop into a place that is much deeper, there's this amazement. It's like, wow, I never believed, I never would have believed that that issue could seem irrelevant. The issue that I was so passionate about, and sure that is what life was all about. We drop into this place, this silence, this stillness, where we know ourselves on a very different dimension, and nothing is really as important as it was before.
And what a humility to see this. I mean, spending all those years to discover something that was always here. I mean, what a joke on one level, and what a deep pain, and what a beauty and love. It's amazing.
It is.
I have a question on a very practical level, because you always say that our seeking needs to be practical. I have a hard time when you always say when you relate to the normal, natural function of life, because I feel a deep guilt inside of myself, and maybe that's just an escape, just to participate in a world that is so dysfunctional. But I see that this is all just based on my wrong identity of not really knowing about this inner place of contentment. Maybe that's why it's all just faulty thinking, and I just maybe give it some time to just adjust and burp it out or something.
Yeah, well, along the lines that I just mentioned, I think in those moments that you might have some explanation for yourself about, why you don't want to participate in certain things, if you dropped into this place in a way that all of that fades away, because we're not coming up with the rationale that we had when we were feeling guilty. It's like, just leave that alone, leave it be.
Amazing, yes. And some days ago, I had this, when you spoke about metaphors, I had this strong feeling that something dropped inside of me, dropped away. Like I was so intimidated by metaphors. And for some reasons, like already the idea of God is a big metaphor, and there's so much connected with it in regard to all the suffering, the blame, the guilt, and whatever, and it just dropped away. And this was so nice, just not to be intimidated by my own thinking. I mean, what a prison it is that I carry around with me, and amazing.
Yeah. Well,
thank you so much.
Say that again, the last thing.
Just thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for dropping in as usual.
Wonderful.
Okay. Hi, Jaroslav.
Hello, Roger.
Hello.
How are you?
Yes, very good. And you?
Yeah, I'm very good. A little bit sleepy because don't sleep so much this night, but I have some question to you, so I'd like to ask you.
Oh,
so
yes.
Can you...
Heaven and hell.
Yeah.
Shall we talk about heaven and hell?
Yeah, heaven and hell. Yes. This. You remember you said that it was too late to answer this question, but I've seen many satsangs of you earlier, and you talk about this, and I was listening. But from my experience, when I was younger and when I go to church, I have some experience which I want to share that I see like in church. Maybe it was my fantasy, I don't know, but this was so real for me. Like this really dark energy, like some shadows, and it was in my life maybe 3 or 4 times. I see this like very like to the core, this energy like this like dark. So I am like thinking what's going on, and I am like want to like reorganize this for myself. So I'd like to share this experience with you and ask about your knowledge in this area. Okay, this is the one. I have a couple, but so maybe because I was not sure that today I will be able to talk with you. So I don't like practice my English maybe so much, but I did, okay. So okay, because I have prepared this question earlier. I was doing some work in my school. Okay, so now, so in this area in heaven, so is this like real? Is this only like illusion of mind? And because I heard this idea, and I'm sorry that maybe my thinking now I am in my mind, and you can say that I should like drop it in my being, but this is like maybe some my intellectual curiosity to you, to ask you about this, and because this idea like to be to love like the idea there is evil, let's say in maybe this aspect, but what you think about this idea that we should like love everything, like accept, because like we like love devil is like accepting not wanting part of ourselves. Is this for you? Is this like maybe connected idea? Yes. So yes, this is like for you. Please, can you ask?
So you have the question about dark energy, the question about heaven and hell, and the question about loving everyone.
Yes, this is connected. This is like good idea to be to path to liberation. Is it love like also this maybe not nice part on life?
So these
this is change.
So
like, okay,
if I were to hear a voice of my grandfather, for example, and have a conversation or get a message from what is the voice of my grandfather, my relation to that is that it is part of the experience that I'm having now. It doesn't, in the way I would interpret it, it doesn't mean that my grandfather exists somewhere. It doesn't mean he's in heaven. It might be, he might, like, to me, I just say, I had this experience. I would say, I heard his voice. I even turned around because it was so much like he was behind me. And there was nothing there. And then as I kept walking forward, the voice started talking to me, right? So my relationship to that is, I wouldn't deny the voice. I would say, I had this experience. What I conclude about it could be very problematic. If I then say that is proof that there is an afterlife, then I've added a conclusion about the voice that is not presented in the experience. I just say, wow, it was a interesting experience. I have dreams where I dream of Ramesh being in the dream. I've had some dreams of friends that have died, and the quality of the dream is amazing. It's like they're alive again. And I enjoy the experience, or I appreciate the experience for the experience of it. So I have had the sense of being in certain places and get a sense that there is something strange there. Maybe I get an intuition to leave, and I say to someone, there's a very strange feeling in there, and they say, it's not, everyone says that there's stories about this place being haunted, for example. I say, oh, well, that's interesting, because I felt the experience. Now, if I feel the experience and no one else confirms it, it's the experience. So you can look, in my opinion, you can look at the dark energy you had in the church as an experience. We also have to realize that our experience is very subjective. It's like we might feel this strange feeling because of maybe even just a smell of mold or something that, or the a certain darkness, the fact that there could be some shadows, and it just gives us a strange, the whole thing on a subconscious level creates a feeling inside of us. So we might call it, I had this very strange feeling that there was an entity, for example. Well, we don't know why that experience was created. It could just be a sense that is created because of a whole lot of things in the environment. It could be because there actually is some energetic, all of life is energy, right? So even the belief in personal doership and attachment is an energy. So I am not surprised that there can be energy is sensed. There are places where I have found very specific energy. When I go to Tiruvannamalai, there is a very specific energy in the area. Now
sound quality.
Pardon me?
It's something with sound. I hear you a little bit less. Can you please repeat now?
Yeah, there are some places on Earth that have certain energies. Like if you go to Tiruvannamalai, I feel an energy when I'm there. Now, whether that's a psychosomatic thing. Well, I have to change my battery on my microphone. Not the other. Okay, so we're back.
Yeah, we are back.
So I was saying there are places on Earth that have a very particular energy that I feel. Now, I don't know if it's psychosomatic, where I expect that and I go and I feel it because I expect it. I tend to think it's not that because I often go having forgot how I feel the year before. And then suddenly it hits me. I realize I'm feeling it, and I also noticed that I hadn't been thinking about that for days beforehand, and then I feel it. But anyway, my point is that I take the experience as the experience, but I don't necessarily form any strong conclusions about why it's like that. If the experience tends to give me hints and repetition about things, and I see certain correlations, then I will form a relative conclusion that says, well, it feels like this to me. But really, I just, at the end of the day, say it's an experience. It's part of the experience. Heaven and hell, I've never come across either of those. As I read certain wisdom teachings, I see very much that they use heaven and hell as a metaphor for the way that we experience ourselves and therefore the way we experience life. Heaven is, to me, the metaphor for the end of suffering, the same as nirvana. And hell would be how one feels when there's all of this heaviness and sense of despair and shame And you can imagine that if you are going to be sent to hell, which is like meant to be this punishment, this horrible feeling, when you think about it, you say, well, if my whole life if I was put in hell and what I felt there was all the torment of suffering, that would be hell. That would be hell. And when that torment is lifted, that's, we could say that's bliss. It's really just the absence of hell, which could be heaven.
Okay, but are you rather thinking that heaven is like we can, in this moment, created this here on the earth, is rather than is like idea in the future after death? Yes, this is like you more are subscribing in this here on earth.
Yes, but it doesn't.
Yes.
But yes, it is, but not heaven where there are angels and there are fruit trees everywhere and nice waterfalls and everything I need. Heaven is in our situation, whatever our situation is. Even if we break our leg, that can be heaven if we have the right attitude, and there is peace. So nothing, for me, nothing needs to change on earth for there to be heaven on earth. It doesn't require.
This idea. Yeah. Okay. Can you want to continue something?
Oh, I was going to say it doesn't require some big, golden age awakening or the coming of Aquarius or whatever. For me, it is simply about our attitude right here, right now. The notion of waiting for heaven is hell.
Yeah. Expectation in your teaching, like
yes,
one of things of suffering. Yes, and this idea like loving devil to death. Some I heard from some other teachers that this is like you like the path to like liberation is trying to love like evil, like devil.
Yeah. Well, the problem is if you try to be different from how you are, then you are, if you fail, if it doesn't work, then you will judge yourself. So in this teaching, it says, you don't need to do anything. Just allow yourself to be and realize that is life living the instrument that life has designed. And so if the attitude becomes the attitude of allowing life to live you, then by default there will be acceptance of life and acceptance of the other. And to me, accepting the other means not hating the other. And so not hating the other means loving the other. So loving the other doesn't mean that you have to go around embracing everyone and inviting everyone into your house. To me, loving the other means just don't hate the other. And hate in this context means don't blame the other, don't have expectations on the other, don't judge the other. That's expectation. That's love for me. Now, when I say don't judge the other, you can't do that as a prescription. You can't do that as something that I have to go out and do. It will happen when life delivers the new conditioning that allows the doership to fall away because it's seen to be an additional or a lens on through which life is seen that isn't how life actually is. So as we start seeing life more and more as it is, by default we start accepting life as it is.
Yes. Do you find in yourself like this feeling sometimes like anger arising, or even like anger is less and less in your like vehicle?
There's two sorts of anger. There's the biological anger in the moment, and at the same time as that biological anger, if someone keeps, being persistent, and I ask them to stop, and they keep doing something, I might say, listen, enough's enough. Now, that to me is the biological, but after that, there's no psychological shame for myself, and there's no psychological blame for them having pushed, having acted repetitively to make me have to say, look, enough's enough. So that irritation, anger, it doesn't have any suffering in it. It's
So
just...
in relative...
Go on.
Can I say?
Yes.
So am I listening to you? So in relative quick time, you can this person which like might arising like anger with you, in relative quick time you can give him like 5. Have 5 in other situation. You are not like attached to this feeling and this psychological thinking about what's happened. Yes.
Yeah. What was the 5? You said something.
Yes, give 5. Like in other situation. Like you know, like nothing like really happens. It's like life. It happens. Yes?
Yeah, but even that.
Sorry, high 5.
High 5.
Holder, like correct me. Yes, high 5.
High 5. Yeah, at another time that maybe it wouldn't irritate me, but to me the irritation in one situation and then the irritation not happening in another situation is not because in one situation there was suffering and then I didn't get involved with the suffering, and in the other situation the suffering didn't arise. The way I see it is that in one situation anger arose, which was a biological reaction, and in another situation anger didn't arise or irritation didn't arise. And in both situations, there was no guilt or blame. So because this idea that we have of how we should act, often the equanimity, if we hear about equanimity, we sometimes think that means on a biological level, that we will, sit and be Zen, like on a biological level. That's not where the equanimity lies, not on the biological. And thankfully we had some sages like Nisargadatta and even Ramana, who at times would get irritated and angry. Nisargadatta much more, but Ramana, it's important for us to understand, because Ramana is the sort of epitome of a sage. And it's very important for us to see in the writings that he would get irritated with his assistant for trying to give him his medication when he didn't feel like having it. He would say, it's time for your medication, and Ramana would tell him, look, go away, stop annoying me. And that's the biological irritation or anger. And yet then there's no hatred for the person, no seeing him as the doer and seeing yourself as the doer. You might say, look, I'm sorry for being irritable with you. My leg is really hurting, and it means that I have a short temper when my leg is really hurting. So sorry, there can be that apology, but not shame. You're just explaining, it's not personal. But not if the other person doesn't accept it, so be it. He didn't accept my explanation.
Yes. For me, I am grateful for your answer, and I feel like fulfilled by your answer, like in this relative perspective. And so, Roger, this is a big question for me, because from the child I have like some love to some subject. I mean math. I love, like, for me, and I have some question about your perception on mathematics.
Yeah.
Because for me, do you think maybe this was now I put a question, but I want a little bit elaborate. But the ask is for you, like, math maybe language of God, because this is maybe sometimes we hear this that math is a language of God. And what I mean, because as we say in relative like seeing, math describes like physics, like on the quantum level, and there's in terms of probability, but also in this Newtonian mechanical things, chemistry, computer science, all like this subject using math. So what do you think, and do you like the subject in your school when you were like boy? From my side, I love math. For me, math has like beauty, aesthetics, order, many connectivity in it. I think math help navigate reality, gives like models.
I'll give you. I appreciate your question. There are quite a few people waiting to ask questions, so I'll give you a quick answer. I think often maths and physics are underappreciated as being highly creative. Often people think that it is logic, and logic is the opposite of creativity, whereas in fact, when math is understood in its high levels, and I don't think I come close to understanding it there, we understand that math is actually exceptionally creative. There are very elegant ways of solving problems, and there are very elegant ways of explaining things. And once we start getting into the elegance of mathematics, it moves into the realms of extremely high creativity. So I hope that satisfies you.
Yes, really. So we can use our minds. We can use our minds, because like being in this being, it's not like I can't use my mind, and because sometimes I'm afraid that I will be like, maybe when we want too long to stay in this being, like I will be dumb, or maybe somebody will control my life. Such thoughts sometimes happens.
Yeah.
But maybe this is for the another time, because I know that other people like want to talk to you. So
yes.
Maybe last words from you. So
yeah, I mean, sometimes we need to stop the mind in order to connect into the realm that is outside of thinking. That is important because, and then at some point we can move back into thinking and use the thinking as part of the functional aspect of life and the creative aspect of life, without losing touch of that dimension that is outside of thinking. So, for me, the idea that thinking is the problem per se is not at all right. But thinking does keep us within a certain framework until we break out of it. Then until we get broken out of it by life. Once we've broken out of it, we start to realize that there is life irrespective of our conceptualizing. That's where we know ourselves at our core. And then we can move back into thinking without that thinking obscuring our being. So we'll leave it there for today.
It was really nice to talk to you. So have a great evening, and yes. So I hope I can ask you some maybe 3 more questions, but another time.
Yes.
Yes. So cheers to you.
Very good. Thank you. Sleep well tonight. Hi Tara, it's Roger. What? Hold on a sec. We'll just. Yep, Tara.
She has to unmute. Hi. I can't seem to get the unmute thing to work. So thanks again for spending time to share these teachings. It makes a big difference.
Good. Pleasure.
For me, I think this is a cool transition, because what I'm wondering about is thinking as functional. And it relates to one of the last things you said before taking questions, relating to that 5G and maybe all of that, and having that be a stop.
Mm-hmm.
That can just stop, and there can be maybe coming into being. And then I'm wondering how that relates to like the organism keeping itself alive, like this functional thinking. Like if a boulder's rolling towards you, you'll probably get out of the way.
Yeah.
And I spend a lot of time like watching planning happening and predicting happening. So I think my example is that I was living in New York City, and I thought I had a planning. I made up a story. I was like, it's not safe to stay here and I need to leave. And that's not verifiable, but I left as a way to keep the organism alive. And so I'm wondering how much is that story and functional, and how much does that make sense?
Yeah. I think basically we can say that if the thinking is thinking about something you're going to do, something that needs to be done, then it's fine. It's part of the thinking around that topic. If you find, like a lot of our thinking, we just keep mulling over it and over it, and there's, and we say, well, I say, what are you going to do about it? What is this thinking helping? What action are you actually going to put in place? And often we find that there's, I've thought about it as much as we think about it, and it just feels like it's relevant to keep thinking about it. And in fact, when we look at it, that thinking is not at all functional. It's become a loop of psychological thinking. So to the extent that you thought about it and you left, you thought about it based on, the information you had at the time, and it led to an action, and that's it. So now you don't need to worry about the fact that that's what you were thinking. And if you feel like going back, if you can, you say, okay, now I'm going to go back. It's more about the stuff that isn't part of your actual functioning, that sort of thinking about the past and about the future, and blaming, regretting, all of that stuff.
It seems like it's muddy for me. So there's like all these debates about vaccines right now. So then that occurs to me like suffering. It's like a debate back and forth, and there's nothing verifiable there. There's not very much. So then it's just I think it's like suffering in the brain, trying to decide, should I take the vaccine or not take the vaccine? That's just an example.
Yeah, and it doesn't even exist yet.
Yeah.
So by then, who knows what will have happened? So for me, I think as soon as I see all of this thinking based on something that doesn't even exist, and that at the time will have a whole different set of parameters to think about, I go, let me just let it be. But that's really my answer about something like that. But I also find that the quality of people's thinking is appalling often, and it's very much linked to suffering, because if we can't think properly, we're not going to, if we can't observe and make accurate assessments, then it makes sense that we're not going to see life clearly. We're not going to see the mechanisms as they are. And so, I find it interesting sometimes that people say, something like, vaccines are terrible. And in fact, if we were to press a simulate button that removed vaccines in history, human health would probably look very different. Now, as soon as I say that, I understand that people are going to say, you see, you've been fooled by the fact that a vaccine has never ever cured any illness. And so if you press the simulate button with that not happening, human health would be much better than it is now. And so I think, oh, wow, okay. I'm not going to go into, for me, I'm not going to go into that sort of speculation, because I just don't see life and the other as in such a suspicious way. I understand, because I see egoic principle. I understand that there are always going to be power struggles until the egoic construct collapses, and then if it collapses in all of humanity, the whole structure is going to be different. So I'm not kidding myself that there haven't been conspiracies in history. I'm not kidding myself in thinking that there aren't, big lobby groups that are controlled by a lot of money and influence politics and decisions, and that things that aren't healthy for humans get put in place for money. I can't understand that the intelligence of human thinking hasn't come up with a way of extracting free energy. I'm sure it has, and then there's the interests of oil lobbies and fossil fuels that say, hey, we can't roll that out, because if we roll that out, what about all the money that's in the ground that we won't be able to monetize, or all the oil in the ground? So I don't kid myself to think that those things don't exist, but I also don't kid myself that I can make a difference to that. And if I found humanity, when I wake up one morning and there is a movement that actually seems to make sense to me, I'll be on that side of it. You won't find a resistance from me that says, no, I think we have to let big business win out. But for me to be fighting the system, the structure, on an ongoing basis, thinking I actually understand the structure, which none of the people I see getting up there that say, we need to have our civil liberties back, let's go back to work, or whatever, they're doing it because not being at work is painful for them. And so they're just sort of fighting for what seems to be the end of pain for them. The fact that it may lead to many, many deaths is just something they're not considering at the moment. They don't want to consider it. They just want to think of a way that life is not going to be painful the way it is now. Their businesses might be suffering. So they just don't want whatever is causing that. And instead of seeing the virus as the thing causing it, they want something more controllable. So they say, we want to rally and riot. And don't get me wrong, I'm not actually taking a position. I take the position of not taking a position. That's what I'm really trying to get at. Because life is so complex. As soon as we think we know how things work, we're going to be proved wrong. So once our thinking registers this, then we can start living in a simple way and say, actually, I'm just going to take one step at a time, and when an actual decision is called on me, I then have to make that decision. Until then, I'm not going to pretend that I understand how very complex systems work, and I'm not going to pretend that I can foresee all of the variables that are going to change at some time in the future and try and worry about a decision that I'll make that will actually be made very simply at that other point in time down the track. So I hope that what I'm saying doesn't get taken as a anything other than a description of what I see. I just see thinking processes that keep people in a state of uncomfortableness with themselves and with others, where they're making the other the problem instead of realizing, wow, life is this big, complex unfolding. We're in it. We can't control it, and stop trying to.
Yeah, cool. So it's like I didn't actually experience a lot of suffering around leaving New York City, but I had this opinion, like I made something up that I wasn't really experiencing, that the government was gonna, whatever, it could be under the umbrella of a conspiracy theory. But I just made something up that I wasn't going to be able to get food, and there was food rationing or something like that. And I left. But the difference is that there was I was doing what I thought and felt to do in the moment, and there was not that much added thinking to it. even though it's part of an opinion.
No, but frankly, I think your assessment at the time was pretty rational. The fact that your assessment ends up being wrong is not so important. It's if you feel like I need to get away from a city that's in lockdown because you know I'll have to wait for food trucks to come and give me food if that's what happens. If that's not so stupid. If you could see what was coming because you could see what was happening in other countries, then if you've got a country house somewhere, saying I'm going to go there makes sense. You might be wrong, but it makes sense that if there is a circumstance where a decision can and needs to be made, then do that and leave the outcome to be whatever it is.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi, Carla.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much. I appreciate it very, very much for making your time available to us.
You're welcome.
My question is not on an intellectual level, because on an intellectual level, I understand and accept, and I'm totally okay with it. I want to give you a brief information about myself that I've been meditating for a long time, about 20, 25 years, but recently, the last 2 years, thanks to Eckhart Tolle, I understood the meaning of being present, the real meaning of being present. And my meditation since then became deeper, and I was able to control my thoughts and even stop it and being aware of it when I'm thinking. So my presence became intense. Now and since it became intense, my meditation became intense. So I feel that there is an opening within me, and there is a movement energetically, and mostly in my heart. There's a contraction. It's a heavy, even sometimes it's bothering me. It's a heavy feeling. It's not really bothering me, but I feel that energy moving within me as my presence intensifies, and I'm able to do it. So at this point, my question is this: I don't follow any particular teaching, but I watch a lot of videos, and in some of those videos, some of the liberated people, when they talked about their shifting experience, they described it such as this: that I felt like I was going to have an heart attack, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. So my question is this: if we are not the doer, as I'm meditating, am I able to, I feel this description is in my subconscious, and it created a fear. So during my meditation, I'm afraid to go deeper. So my question is this: if we are not the doer, can my ego get in the way of my liberation and going deeper? I don't know if...
Yeah, well, if you're using the word ego in the way, let's say, that most teachings use it, ego is what is in the way of liberation. So ego the word that we would use for the word ego as it's used in other teachings would be the belief in doership and attachment to outcomes. And liberation is the end of the belief in doership and attachment to outcomes, because that doership and attachment to outcomes turns into guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, which is all suffering. So suffering coming from the belief in doership and attachment to outcome. Enlightenment, liberation, according to this teaching, is the end of that suffering, or the converse is continuous, unbroken peace of mind in daily living. So liberation means the end of suffering, or peace of mind in daily living. So going deeper in meditation may not be that important. If you think that liberation or enlightenment is something to do with meditation, and you'll find it in a meditation experience, then obviously you're going to need your meditation to look a certain way, or you're going to hope it turns into something. Because so is that what you think liberation is? Something to do with an experience?
Honestly, I have no idea. I'm just, as other people describe their own shifting of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
they describe that is an experience. I haven't had that experience. I just have this energy moving in me, and I can go deeper, but I feel like I'm stopping it. And so my question is, am I stopping it?
Well,
Can I do anything to stop it?
no, but some movements. The point of not being the doer means whatever is happening is not you doing it, right? But that doesn't mean that a functioning that prevents something from happening can't happen. But if that functioning that prevents something from happening happens, it's not your doing. So it means it's destiny for that fear, let's say, to come up, and it is destiny for the fear to prevent the meditation going deeper. The problem is, if you are having heart problems, it would be a shame for you to think it's got to do with your meditation when in fact it's heart problems. So don't rule out the fact that you should go and get your heart looked at. If you do that and it seems like it's fine, then you could, form this conclusion that says it's something to do with the awakening process. And it could very well be that, because the awakening process often is a rejigging of energies in the system, and beliefs tend to block energetic systems. So as certain beliefs weaken, which often happens when our thinking quietens down, and in meditation the thinking is quietening down. So it makes sense that the system is being rejigged, and one of the main energy centers in the body is the heart center. It's the central chakra, which is the central energy center. The heart is central on many different layers. The physical layer, it's the central, pump. And on the energetic level, there are a lot of nadis and different channels that come off that. So the heart is the center. So if energies and blockages are shifting, then it makes sense that you might be feeling sensations in the heart. Another reason that you might feel this heaviness in the heart is that these energy centers, so the heart chakra is one energy center, when there is unresolved trauma or suffering, essentially, from events in the past that have created a shutting down of the heart center, a blocking of the heart center. That part of the clearing out of the system, or clearing out of the energy system, is to undo those historic traumas. So there's a lot of reasons why you might be feeling energy moving in your heart center when you are meditating. So my suggestion is bring an awareness to that space without trying to do anything, but a curiosity, wondering what it is. I am hesitant to say don't be afraid, because the fact is that you don't want to mistake an actual heart condition and not do anything about it for an awakening. But I do... Go on.
I'm sorry that I don't have a heart condition. I'm totally physically fine. So if you can tell me that I shouldn't be afraid, then I'll take that in consideration.
On the basis that you don't have a heart condition, then the fear that comes up is an existential fear. It is a fear of the me that only knows itself based on thought and knows itself based on its place in the physical world. It is that me identity freaking out, because as we go deeper, we go more into the quantum, the formless, the empty, the spaceless realm. And the sense is, I am disappearing, I'm vanishing, I don't exist. And so keep attention on the basic sense of I, not the thought I, not the I that you've always known, but the very just basic sense of I am, or existence, awareness, which is not a thought thing, it's a feeling. And if you can rest on this I, which doesn't dissolve as you go deeper, the presence, the existence remains. It's as you go deeper, that is the core all the way down. And so if you can realize, the sense that I exist as a human being is because of this this sense I that doesn't disappear when we go deep in meditation. What disappears is the outer clothing that we may have been, we are identified with. And so when that clothing sort of seems to fall away, if we haven't refocused our attention on the I that remains, which is a feeling, I, just a sense of existence. So if I asked you when you were in meditation, are you dead? You don't have to think about it, you just have this sense of presence. So the sense of presence is, I'm alive, I am. So remain focused on this, that presence that tells you experientially you are not dead, you are still here. And don't worry about the fact that the thoughts, the sensations, the body, all of that has collapsed. Going deep is never going to hurt you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Roger. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, well, sorry for those of you guys that I didn't get round to today, but stick your hand up tomorrow and we'll hopefully give you a go then. Thanks for joining and see you next time.